The stars had always whispered of humanity. To the alien races scattered across the galaxy, humans were little more than a story. A myth. A species that had barely made it past the Stone Age, never meant to pose any real threat. For centuries, they were ignored, their homeworld Earth written off as a backwater planet, too insignificant to matter. Alien empires rose and fell, conquering and enslaving species much older and stronger than humanity. The Vora were no different. The Vora were an insected race, their fleets the largest and most powerful in the galaxy. Their ships were monstrous, their weapons capable of shattering entire worlds. They had spread like a plague, consuming and destroying everything in their path. No one had ever dared challenge their might, until now. Now the Vora had come to Earth, not to conquer but to make a statement. Their fleet, thousands of ships strong, loomed on the edge of human space. Their intent was clear: annihilate the humans before they became a real problem. The Vora believed that humanity had no place in the galaxy, and they would erase the myth once and for all. The Titanic was humanity's answer. A single ship, just one, against an entire armada. The Titanic was a warship like no other, a marvel of human engineering and defiance. It had been under construction for years, an idea born from desperation and a fierce determination to survive. The ship's hull was made of materials stronger than any metal the Vora had encountered. Its weapons were built to pierce the toughest defenses. Its shields could withstand the explosive power of a star's core. The Titanic was no myth, it was real. And it was coming. Captain Nathaniel Wells stood on the bridge, staring out at the vastness of space, his eyes cold and focused. He was a man of few words, but the weight of what he was about to face hung heavy in the air. The crew on the bridge moved with quiet precision, each one knowing that today they were about to make history. "Report," Captain Wells barked. Lieutenant Jackson, a young officer with a steady voice, looked up from his station. "All systems are operational, Captain. We're ready to engage." Wells nodded, his jaw set. He had seen the enemy fleet on the scanners. The Vora Armada was enormous, stretching across the stars like a wall of destruction. Thousands of ships, each one bristling with weaponry. The Vora had underestimated humanity before. Now they were about to see the consequences of that mistake. "Enemy fleet has entered sensor range," Lieutenant Jackson continued. "They're preparing for a full assault." Wells stood tall, his fingers gripping the railing in front of him. He had been in battles before, but this was different. The stakes had never been higher. If they failed, humanity would be wiped from existence. But if they succeeded, it would send a message across the galaxy. A message that humanity was no myth, that they were a force to be reckoned with. The Vora ships appeared on the view screen, massive and intimidating. Their designs were sleek, their edges sharp like the fangs of a predatory beast. The Titanic, in contrast, was a brute. A lumbering giant built to take punishment and deliver devastation in return. It looked small compared to the vastness of the Vora fleet, but Wells knew that size didn't matter. What mattered was power, and humanity's power was just beginning to show itself. "Captain," Lieutenant Jackson said, "the enemy is opening fire." Wells' gaze never left the view screen as the first wave of Vora weapons streaked toward the Titanic. A barrage of plasma bolts, missiles, and energy blasts erupted from the enemy ships. The Titanic rocked as the first wave of explosions hit its shields. The energy was immense, like being struck by 1,000 thunderstorms at once. But the Titanic didn't buckle. The shields flared bright, absorbing the blasts like a sponge soaking up water. "Is this all they've got?" Wells muttered under his breath, watching the energy readings flicker. The Titanic's shields were holding, but it wouldn't last forever. The Vora were relentless. "Captain, the shields are holding, but we're taking heavy damage to the outer layers," Jackson reported. "We can't keep this up for long." Wells clenched his fists. "We don't need to keep it up long," he said, his voice low and fierce. "Give them everything we've got." The crew sprang into action, their faces a mix of fear and determination. The Titanic had been designed for this moment. It had been built for revenge. Revenge for every alien race that had ever looked down on humanity. Revenge for every time humans were told they were too weak to matter. Now was their time. The massive turrets on the Titanic came to life, swiveling as they powered up. The crew had trained for this moment their entire lives. Every inch of the ship, every weapon, every system was tuned to perfection. The first blast from the Titanic's main cannon ripped through the void, a beam of energy so intense that it lit up the surrounding stars. It hit one of the Vora's massive destroyers dead center. The ship didn't stand a chance. The beam tore through its armor like tissue paper, and the ship exploded in a brilliant flash of light. The Vora fleet fell silent for a moment, Then panic set in. They destroyed the Revenant, a Vora officer gasped in disbelief. Admiral Jarok, the commander of the Vora fleet, stood on the bridge of his flagship watching the chaos unfold. His antennas twitched with agitation. "It's just one ship," he muttered. "Just one human ship. It can't." Another blast from the Titanic hit a cruiser, obliterating it in an instant. The shockwave sent other ships careening off course, their shields failing as they collided with debris. "This isn't possible," Admiral Jarok growled. "No species should be this strong." The Titanic was no myth. It was real, and it was tearing through the Vora fleet like a blade through paper. And for the first time, the Vora realized the truth. Humanity was no longer a myth. It was a monster. "Prepare for counterattack," Jarok ordered, his voice filled with fury. "They must be destroyed." The battle had only just begun, and already the galaxy was about to learn that humanity was not a species to be trifled with. The Titanic was here, and it was unstoppable. Admiral Jarok's eyes glowed with the fury of 1,000 suns as he watched the Titanic rip through his fleet. The ship was like a ghost, its firepower relentless, its armor unbreakable. The human warship was a nightmare come to life. He had underestimated them. He had thought they were weak, fragile. But now the full force of humanity's strength was on display, and it was terrifying. "Admiral, we've lost 3 of our capital ships," screamed one of his officers, his voice shaking with fear. Jarok didn't respond immediately. His mandibles clicked together as he fought to suppress the panic rising in his chest. This wasn't supposed to happen. The Vora had destroyed hundreds of civilizations, wiped out species that had far more advanced technology than the humans. The Titanic was just one ship, one human ship, but it was killing them all. "Pull together, you weaklings," Jarok roared, his voice rising with anger. "We will not be defeated by a single vessel. Prepare all forces for an immediate counteroffensive." On the Titanic, Captain Wells stood in silence, watching the devastation unfold. The hum of the ship's engines, the steady beep of the consoles, it all felt like a distant hum in his ears. He was focused only on the battle. His hand was steady on the command chair, his face etched with determination. He had seen the fear in the Vora fleet's movements. They were trying to regroup, trying to save what was left of their forces. But the Titanic wasn't finished yet. "Lieutenant Jackson, status report," Wells said, his voice calm but urgent. "Shields are at 75%, Jackson replied, his fingers flying over the console. "We've sustained some damage to the outer layers, but nothing that will stop us." Wells nodded. The Titanic was a fortress. The Vora might be throwing everything they had at it, but it would take more than that to bring them down. He wasn't about to let up. Not now. Not when humanity's future was at stake. "All guns target the Vora flagship," Wells ordered. The Titanic's massive weapons locked on to the enemy flagship, a ship that dwarfed even the Titanic in size. The Chiton's Fury, a name that struck fear into the hearts of every species the Vora had encountered. It was their pride, their symbol of dominance. And now it was in the Titanic's crosshairs. The Titanic fired. A beam of pure destruction tore through space, a blinding flash of light that collided with the Chiton's Fury. The impact was like a supernova, the explosion sending ripples through space itself. The Vora flagship shook as its shields collapsed, its hull buckling under the force of the blow. The crew of the Titanic held their breath as they watched. The Chiton's Fury was still there, its lights flickering, but the damage was immense. The Vora flagship was already on the verge of collapse. Jarok's voice came through the comms, his tone dark and full of rage. "This is not the end. We will crush you humans." But Wells wasn't listening anymore. His focus was on the battlefield, on the destruction he was about to unleash. His hands gripped the controls and his voice was cold. "Prepare for another round of fire. Full power to the forward guns." The Titanic's guns powered up again, their cannons charging with deadly energy. This time there would be no holding back. The Vora responded with everything they had left. A storm of missiles and energy blasts flew toward the Titanic. The crew braced for impact as the first wave hit, the ship shuddering under the pressure. But the Titanic didn't flinch. The shields absorbed the blows, and the ship kept moving forward, unstoppable. Another barrage of fire from the Titanic tore through the Vora fleet. A destroyer exploded in a cloud of fire and debris. A cruiser was ripped apart, its twisted remains drifting into the void. The Titanic was a monster, a force of nature that couldn't be stopped. For the first time, the Vora fleet was truly afraid. "Admiral, we're losing ships," one of Jarok's officers cried. "At this rate, we'll be wiped out before we even get a chance to retaliate." Jarok's mandibles twitched, a sign of his mounting frustration. He had underestimated the humans. He had believed their threats were hollow, that they were just another species too weak to defend themselves. But now, with their every attack, the humans proved him wrong. They were strong, stronger than anything he had ever encountered. "We will not retreat," Jarok growled. "We will not be made fools of. Focus all fire on the Titanic. Bring it down." The Vora fleet rallied once more, every remaining ship focusing their fire on the Titanic. The space around the human warship became a storm of energy. Blasts shook the ship, and the hull groaned under the pressure. The shields flickered dangerously, but they held. Wells' grip tightened on the command chair. He could feel the weight of the battle pressing down on him, but his mind was clear. The Vora had underestimated them, and now they would pay. "Captain," Jackson said, his voice tense, "shields are at 50%. We can't take much more of this." Wells nodded. They had to finish this now. "All crew prepare for the final strike," Wells ordered. "Full power to the gravity wells." The Titanic's massive weapons shifted as the gravity well cannons powered up. These were weapons unlike anything the Vora had ever seen, capable of manipulating the very fabric of space itself. The first shot fired, and the effects were immediate. A miniature black hole formed at the heart of the Vora fleet. Ships were drawn toward it, their engines powerless against the pull of gravity. They were crushed, torn apart in an instant, their atoms scattering across the void. The Vora were reeling, their forces scattered, their flagship in ruins. Jarok watched in horror as his fleet crumbled before him. "Impossible," he muttered. "This cannot be happening." The Titanic's gravity well fired again, and this time it hit with even more force. Another ship vanished in a blur of energy. A third followed, and then a fourth. The Vora fleet was falling apart piece by piece, and they couldn't stop it. The Titanic wasn't just a ship. It was humanity's response to the galaxy's arrogance. It was a symbol of their strength, their will to survive, and it was unstoppable. As Jarok watched his fleet disintegrate before his eyes, he realized the truth. Humanity was no myth. It was a monster, and it was coming for them all. The Titanic was like a giant among insects. As it tore through the Vora fleet, a new understanding began to take hold across the galaxy. Humanity was not just a myth. It was a force to be reckoned with, a beast awakened. On the bridge, Captain Nathaniel Wells didn't show any sign of satisfaction. He knew what this battle meant, but there was no time for celebration. The Vora fleet was still vast, and they were relentless. Each blast, each explosion only pushed them to fight harder. "Admiral Jarok has pulled together the remnants of his fleet," Lieutenant Jackson said, eyes locked on the monitor. "They're regrouping. They're not retreating." Wells gave a slow, calculated nod. "They're desperate now, desperate and angry. They'll make one last push." He didn't need to see the fear in their eyes to know what they were thinking. The Titanic had taken down over half of the Vora ships, but the remaining fleet was still a force to be reckoned with. They would regroup. They would come back stronger. "Status of the Titanic?" Wells asked, his voice firm. "Shields are at 45%, Jackson reported. "We've sustained damage to the lower hull, but nothing that threatens our core systems. Weapons are still operational." "Good, we need everything we've got. Tell engineering to prepare the secondary reactors. We're going to need more power." As Jackson relayed the orders, Wells turned his attention back to the view screen. The stars in the distance flickered as the remaining Vora ships closed in on them. The Vora had adjusted their tactics, launching a new wave of smaller, faster ships, likely hoping to overwhelm the Titanic with sheer numbers. They had learned from their mistakes, but they were still underestimating humanity. The Titanic had already proven its strength. It had already shattered the myth of human weakness. Now, it was time to show the Vora that their greatest mistake had been believing that humans could be destroyed. The Vora ships swarmed in from all sides, unleashing a barrage of plasma missiles and high-energy lasers. The storm of destruction was intense, with explosions flashing across the void. The Titanic shook as the first wave hit. Shields flared bright and then dimmed as the ship absorbed the force of the impact. But still, the Titanic pressed forward. "They're throwing everything at us," Jackson said, his voice strained. "They want to break through our defenses." Wells didn't flinch. He had expected this. The Vora were too proud to back down, and they would throw everything they had left at humanity. but it wouldn't be enough. Activate countermeasures, Wells ordered. Launch decoys and prepare the gravity wells. The Titanic released a wave of decoy drones, their engines firing with bright, flashing lights. They zipped toward the Vorships, mimicking the ship's own readings and confusing the enemy targeting systems. At the same time, the ship's gravity wells powered up again, their energy coiling like a serpent preparing to strike. For a moment, there was silence. Then the gravity well shot out again, its energy bending space itself as it created a miniature black hole. The pull was immediate and overwhelming. Dozens of Vorships were caught in its grip, unable to escape. They twisted, contorted, and then collapsed in on themselves, their structures imploding under the crushing force of the singularity. The Vorships around them reeled, some attempting to escape, others just disappearing. Direct hit, Jackson breathed, watching in awe as another wave of enemy ships was obliterated. The Vora fleet had just lost another third of its remaining strength. But still, there were more, and their desperation was palpable. The enemy wasn't retreating. They were more determined than ever to destroy the Titanic. "Captain," Jackson called out, "they've adapted. They're forming a concentrated fire pattern. They're trying to overwhelm us all at once." Wells' mind raced, calculating their next move. The Vora were smarter than they appeared. They were learning, adjusting. But it was too late for them. Humanity's resolve was stronger. The Titanic was still standing, and the Vora had no idea just how much punishment it could take. "Deploy all remaining drones," Wells ordered, his voice sharp. "I want all guns trained on the largest targets." The Titanic's remaining drone fighters swarmed into space, their sleek designs darting through the battlefield. They strafed across the enemy ships, their lasers cutting down Vora ships in rapid succession. The Titanic's cannons fired again, targeting the largest Vora cruisers, obliterating them with pinpoint accuracy. The Titanic was no longer just a ship, it was a living nightmare. "Captain," Jackson said, his voice tight with tension, "the Vora flagship is powering up its main cannon. They're targeting us." The Chiton's Fury had survived longer than its counterparts, and now it was preparing its final move. Its massive cannon was a weapon capable of destroying entire cities. If it hit the Titanic, it would be devastating. Wells didn't hesitate. "All power to the aft shields," he ordered. "Brace for impact." The Titanic turned sharply, its engines roaring as it positioned itself to face the oncoming blast. The Vora flagship fired, and a stream of white-hot energy shot toward the Titanic. The beam was massive, far larger than any weapon the Vora had used before. It hit the Titanic square in the rear, and for a moment, everything seemed to stop. The Titanic rocked violently as the energy beam tore into its aft hull. The ship groaned under the pressure, sparks flying from broken systems. The crew staggered, holding onto their stations as the ship rattled. "Shields are at 20%, Jackson shouted. "We're losing power in the aft sections." Wells gritted his teeth, but his face remained calm. He knew this was the moment. The Titanic could take a beating. It was built to survive. And the Vora had just made the worst mistake of all. They had underestimated humanity's ability to fight through the impossible. "Damage report," Wells barked. "We're still holding," Lieutenant Harris responded, though his voice was strained. "Hull integrity is holding, and we've got secondary power routing back to the rear shields." The Titanic was bleeding, but it wasn't dead. Not yet. The Vora flagship had thrown everything at them, and the Titanic had survived. Now it was time to strike back. "Forward cannons lock onto the Chiton's Fury," Wells ordered. "I want that ship gone." The Titanic's main cannon powered up again, its barrels glowing with deadly energy. The Vora flagship was still in firing range, and now it would pay for underestimating the humans. The Titanic fired. A beam of pure destruction tore through space, cutting through the Vora flagship's shields like paper. The beam punched through its armor and shattered its core. The Chiton's Fury exploded in a brilliant flash of light, its remains scattering into space. A cheer erupted across the bridge of the Titanic, but Wells didn't join them. He knew this wasn't over. There was still more to do. But as the final remnants of the Vora flagship drifted into the darkness, Wells allowed himself a moment. The message was clear now. Humanity was no longer a myth, it was a monster. And the galaxy was about to learn to fear it. The explosion of the Chiton's Fury echoed through the battlefield, a final burst of light that sent shockwaves rippling across the remaining Vora fleet. For a moment, The space around the Titanic fell silent. The massive warship, smoke trailing from its hull and sparks flashing from damaged systems, hovered in the void like a living monument to humanity's strength. It had taken everything the Vora could throw at it, and it had survived. But Wells knew better than to think the battle was over. The Vora weren't a species to simply give up. The destruction of their flagship had shaken them, yes, but it had also driven them into a corner, and cornered animals were the most dangerous. "Report," Captain Wells barked, his voice low and commanding. "Damage control teams are working on all sectors," Lieutenant Jackson replied, his voice steady but tense. "Aft shields are still down, but the rest of the ship is holding. We've sustained heavy damage, Captain. The lower hull's integrity is down to 30%. Wells clenched his fists, his face hardening. It didn't matter. The Titanic was built to endure, and if the Vora wanted to keep fighting, they would get more than they bargained for. "We're not done yet," he said, his tone cold with resolve. "Prepare to engage. Focus fire on the remaining ships." As the crew scrambled to follow orders, Wells watched as the remaining Vora ships regrouped. They were far from finished. Their response was swift. They were no longer scattered and disorganized. They had pulled together, and now, with the loss of their flagship, the rest of the Vora fleet was fully committed to destroying the human ship. "They're forming a new formation," Jackson said, eyes wide with disbelief. It's an all-out assault, Captain. They're surrounding us all sides." Wells' jaw tightened. This was it. The Vora were going to try to overwhelm the Titanic, and they were going to do it with everything they had left. The sheer weight of their attack would be enough to test even the mightiest of warships, but Wells wasn't backing down. "Activate all remaining drones," Wells ordered. "I want those ships to feel the full fury of the Titanic." The Titanic's remaining drone fighters shot out from the ship's belly like a swarm of hornets, their weapons lighting up the dark void as they strafed the Vora fleet. Small but deadly, the drones dove through the Vora lines, striking fast and hard. The Vora fleet retaliated immediately, firing volleys of energy blasts and missiles in all directions, trying to catch the human drones in the chaos. But it was the Titanic itself that the Vora feared most. The Titanic's weapons powered up again, its main guns aimed directly at the closest Vora ships. A barrage of energy beams shot out, each one destroying a Vora destroyer with pinpoint accuracy. The Vora tried to scatter, to spread out, but the Titanic was too fast. Another massive blast from the Titanic obliterated a Vora cruiser, sending it spiraling into space like a burning husk. The Vora responded with a volley of their own. Energy beams and plasma missiles rained down on the Titanic, hammering the ship from every angle. The Titanic shuddered under the pressure, its shields flickering dangerously. The ship groaned, but it didn't break. "Shields at 30%, Jackson shouted. "Captain, we need to pull back. We can't take much more of this." Wells didn't even look at him. His eyes were fixed on the view screen, calculating, watching as the Vora continued to press forward, refusing to give up. "We're not pulling back," Wells said firmly. "The moment we pull back, we give them the victory. We're going to finish this. All power to the forward guns." The Titanic's forward cannons lit up again, unleashing a blast of energy so powerful it seemed to tear apart the very fabric of space. The beam slammed into a Vora battleship, ripping through its hull like a blade through paper. The ship exploded in a massive fireball, the debris scattering in all directions. The Vora fleet wavered, their coordination faltering. The Titanic had made its mark, but the Vora were nothing if not persistent. They reformed their attack, sending in more missiles, more ships, and even a few of their smaller vessels loaded with explosive charges. They were desperate. They had to be. If the Vora lost now, they would lose everything. "We need to end this now," Wells said. "Prepare the gravity wells, full power." The Titanic's gravity well cannons powered up with a deep, low hum. The crew knew what was coming. These weapons bent space itself, creating black holes that would tear apart the very ships the Vora depended on. It was a weapon of last resort, and Wells was ready to use it. "Fire," Wells commanded. A black hole tore open in the fabric of space, pulling a dozen Vora ships into its crushing grip. The ships twisted, their engines unable to resist the pull, and then they were gone, pulverized by the intense gravitational forces. Another shot from the gravity well cannon created another singularity, and another wave of Vora ships vanished without a trace. The battle was beginning to turn. The Vora were losing ships too quickly to recover. The remnants of their fleet were beginning to scatter, some retreating, others frantically trying to keep their formations intact. But there was no escaping the Titanic. There was no surviving against it. "Admiral Jarok, you are finished," Wells said quietly, his voice cold with certainty. But just as Wells thought they had won, a new wave of Vorships appeared on the scanners. Smaller, faster, and deadlier than anything the Titanic had faced yet. The Vora had one last card to play. They had deployed their final reserve fleet, designed to be the last hope for their doomed empire. "Captain, we've got incoming," Jackson shouted. "It's a full assault." The new Vora fleet wasn't here for a fight. They were here for one thing, to make sure the Titanic went down, even if it meant sacrificing everything. Wells' expression darkened. He didn't have the luxury of making mistakes anymore. Every ship, every life depended on him holding his ground. "Hold fast," Wells ordered, slamming his fist onto the console. "We finish this now." The Titanic's guns roared to life. The crew worked in perfect unison, firing, dodging, and outmaneuvering the relentless assault. Explosions shook the ship, but still, the Titanic pressed forward, a monster in its own right. One by one, the Vora ships fell. But the final assault wasn't over yet. The enemy fleet was closing in. Wells could feel the weight of their desperation, the pressure of an entire species willing to sacrifice everything just to destroy the humans. It was the final test. Could they survive it? Wells gripped his command chair, his eyes fixed on the chaos unfolding before him. This was humanity's moment. And they would not back down. The Titanic was a beast, battered but unbroken. Its hull, scarred from the barrage of Vora fire, still held strong. The ship groaned under the pressure, but it was far from surrendering. Captain Nathaniel Wells stood firm on the bridge, his gaze fixed on the viewscreen as the Vora fleet, now desperate, closed in around them. They had made their last stand. The Vora had no more ships to send, but they weren't backing down. They would fight to the bitter end, and it was up to humanity to prove that it was stronger than the galaxy's oldest and most fearsome predators. "Captain," Lieutenant Jackson said, his voice tight with urgency. "The Vora fleet is circling us, trapping us. They're preparing to launch a final assault. We don't have much time before they move in for the kill." Wells gripped the armrests of his chair, his knuckles turning white. The Titanic was surrounded, its shields flickering weakly, its outer hull a twisted mess of scorched metal. It had taken everything the Vora had thrown at it, but now, with their remaining ships closing in for a decisive strike, the pressure was mounting. "We've been through worse," Wells muttered under his breath. "We're not done yet." "Sir, we've got an incoming wave," Lieutenant Harris called from his station. "It's a final strike, everything they have. The Vora have thrown in their reserve fleet, and it's coming at us full force. They're closing fast." Wells stood. This was the moment. He had known the fight would come to this, the desperate end where both sides threw everything they had. The Vora had been too confident, too certain of their superiority, and now they were about to pay the price for their arrogance. "Prepare for the final engagement," Wells ordered. "All weapons lock on to the largest targets. We end this now." The crew sprang into action, each person focused on their task. The Titanic was more than a ship now. It was humanity's heart, its strength, its last hope. Every system, every weapon, every piece of technology had been pushed to its limits, and they were about to give everything to defeat the Vora once and for all. The viewscreen showed the Vora ships drawing closer, their weapons glowing with deadly energy. They had learned from their mistakes. They were no longer trying to surround the Titanic. They were going for a direct strike, every ship targeting the Titanic's critical points. They were throwing their last, desperate push at humanity's doorstep. "Captain," Jackson shouted, "they're launching plasma missiles. If they hit, it'll tear us apart." Wells didn't hesitate. He had prepared for this moment. The Titanic's cannons came to life, roaring as the massive energy beams ripped through the void. The first barrage of plasma missiles was met with a storm of counterfire from the Titanic's defenses. The Vora had made a critical mistake. They had underestimated the human ship's ability to respond, its sheer power. "Brace for impact," Wells commanded. The Titanic rocked as the remaining missiles slammed into its shields. Sparks flew, and the hull groaned, but the shields held. The Vora fleet had given everything they had, but it wasn't enough. The Titanic's weapons fired again, and the Vora ships closest to them exploded in a burst of light. The Titanic's gunners fired with cold precision, each shot a death sentence for a Vora warship. The first wave of Vora ships fell. The plasma missiles had failed. The Vora had pushed forward with everything, but it wasn't enough. The Titanic was still standing, still fighting. The Vora scrambled to regroup, but they had lost their initiative. The human ship was a monster, and it was hungry for revenge. "Captain," Jackson said urgently, his voice rising in disbelief. "There's a new fleet of Vora ships, heavier than before. They've brought in their flagship's backup fleet. They're launching a coordinated assault, everything they've got left. They won't stop until we're dust." Wells' face tightened. His crew had given everything. They had held on despite the odds, but this wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about victory, and victory meant sending the message to the galaxy that humanity was not a species to be underestimated. "Prepare the gravity wells," Wells said, his voice calm but filled with resolve. "We've got one last shot to break them." The Titanic's gravity well cannons powered up again, their deep hum filling the ship. These weapons bent space itself, pulling ships and debris into a void where nothing could survive. The Vora were massing their remaining forces for one last charge, but the Titanic was ready. This would be the final blow. The first black hole shot out, expanding rapidly as it consumed everything in its path. A dozen Vora ships, some of the largest in the fleet, were pulled into the gravitational pull. They twisted and broke apart, their hulls crushed under the pressure, their destruction instantaneous. The Titanic fired again, and the second wave of Vora ships fell just as easily, swept into the event horizon and annihilated in the blink of an eye. The Vora fleet was losing its cohesion. Their final reserve had been shattered. Wells could see the fear in their movements. This was no longer a battle. It was survival. They were running out of time. "Captain," Harris cried, "the flagship, it's coming in, it's making a direct assault on us." Wells turned his gaze to the viewscreen. A massive Vora warship, more terrifying than any they had faced before, was charging toward the Titanic, weapons blazing. The Vora flagship was the last of its kind, the last chance they had to claim victory. Wells' heart raced. This was it. The Vora had thrown their last weapon at humanity. The Titanic was their last hope, and if it fell, humanity's fight for survival would end here. "Fire everything we've got," Wells said, his voice steady but fierce. "Full power to the forward guns, target their main reactor." The Titanic fired again, the blast from its main cannons lighting up the battlefield like a second sun. The beam cut through the void, hitting the Vora flagship square in the center. The Vora ship's shields flared, struggling to hold against the blast, but it was no use. The Titanic's energy was overwhelming. For a moment it seemed as though the Vora flagship might hold. But then the shields collapsed. The Titanic's beam pierced the Vora flagship's hull, sending a shockwave that tore through its heart. The massive ship shuddered, its lights flickering, before it exploded into a ball of fire and debris. The Vora flagship was gone. Silence fell across the battlefield. The Titanic had done it. The Vora had been broken, their forces shattered. The few remaining Vora ships scattered into the void, fleeing into the darkness, too terrified to continue the fight. The battle was over. Captain Wells stood still for a moment, the weight of the moment sinking in. The Titanic had carried humanity's strength into the heart of the galaxy. They had faced the impossible, and they had won. "Captain," Jackson said, his voice low with awe, "we did it, we've won." Wells didn't respond at first. His mind was still on the battlefield, still processing the enormity of what they had just done. But as the Titanic drifted silently in the wake of the battle, Wells finally spoke. "The galaxy will remember this day," he said quietly. "Humanity is no longer a myth, we are the monsters." And the galaxy would tremble at the sound of their name from this day forward. The stars twinkled in eerie silence, broken only by the soft hum of the Titanic's engines. The Vora fleet, once a terrifying presence in the galaxy, was now a shattered memory. The flagship, Chiton's Fury, was gone, and with it the last hope of the Vora to crush humanity. The Titanic had delivered a blow so fierce, so unrelenting that even the Vora, whose ships could consume entire civilizations, had been forced to retreat. Captain Nathaniel Wells stood on the bridge, staring at the debris floating in space, the remnants of the once proud fleet. His eyes were cold, the weight of victory heavy in his chest. The battle was over, but the war was far from finished. Humanity had sent its message, loud and clear, but this was just the beginning. "We did it," Lieutenant Jackson said, his voice almost in disbelief. "We really did it, Captain." Wells didn't reply immediately. His fingers drummed lightly on the edge of his chair, his mind spinning. He could feel the eyes of his crew on him, waiting for his next command, his next words. but there was no celebration on his face. The Titanic had fought hard to survive, but what they had faced today, what they had conquered, wasn't something any species should have to face again. "We didn't just win," Wells said finally, his voice low and filled with a quiet intensity. "We've changed everything." The bridge crew nodded in agreement, but Wells could feel the weight of their fear. The galaxy had seen the power of humanity. The Vora had learned that the hard way. But if one enemy had learned the truth, what about the others? The other alien races that had long ignored humanity's potential. The Titanic had shown them that humans were not only capable of survival, they were capable of dominance. "Damage report," Wells asked, his voice steady. "Minor structural damage to the lower decks," Jackson replied, his hands flying over the controls. "Shields are still holding at 50%, but overall we've made it through." The crew released a collective sigh of relief, but the truth hung heavily in the air. The Titanic was battered, its hull torn from the endless barrage of Vora weapons, but it had survived. That was something the galaxy hadn't seen before, a human warship with all the odds against it, still standing tall. Wells glanced at the viewscreen again, his expression hardening. The remains of the Vora fleet were scattered like broken toys, floating in the silence of space. But somewhere out there, other alien fleets would be watching, analyzing the wreckage. And those alien empires, they would not forget what had just happened. They would remember that a single human ship had shattered an armada. And they would be afraid. "We need to make contact with the rest of the fleet," Wells said, his voice gaining strength. "Set up a comm link. Let's tell Earth we've succeeded." As the communications team set up the link, Wells' mind drifted back to the battle. He could still hear the screams of dying Vora ships as the Titanic's cannons rained down destruction on them. The sound of their fear, their desperation, was something he would never forget. It was a reminder of how far humanity had come, a reminder of how far they could go. "Captain, we're receiving a message from Earth," the comms officer announced, breaking Wells from his thoughts. "Put it through," Wells ordered. The screen flickered for a moment, and then the face of Admiral Klein, Earth's commanding officer, appeared on the screen. His face was lined with stress, his eyes tired, but the smile on his face spoke volumes. "We were beginning to worry, Captain," Admiral Klein said, his voice heavy with relief. "The entire planet was holding its breath. You've made history." Wells allowed himself a brief, small smile, though his eyes remained focused. "We've done more than that, sir. We've shattered a myth, but the job not finished yet." "I know," Klein replied. "You've broken the Vora, but there's more at stake here. You've drawn attention. The other alien empires will be watching. They'll know the Vora weren't a fluke. We need to be ready. Humanity cannot afford to sit back and relax." Wells nodded. "We've sent our message, Admiral, and we won't back down, not now." The weight of Klein's words hung in the air, the reminder of what came next. Humanity had drawn first blood, but the galaxy was vast. There were countless species out there, watching, waiting. And now they knew humanity was not a myth. It was a power to be reckoned with. "Understood, Captain," Klein said. "You've got full support from Earth. You've done us proud." The communication ended, and the bridge fell into a tense silence. Wells stood, his eyes scanning the viewscreen. The Vora had been defeated, but the true test was still ahead. The Titanic had proven its might, but what about the rest of humanity? Would they be ready for what was to come? Would they stand together when the next empire came knocking? Wells knew that their victory today had bought them time. But time was all it was, nothing more. "Captain," Jackson said, drawing Wells' attention back to the bridge. "What now? What's our next move?" Wells turned to face him, his eyes narrowing as he considered the question. The Titanic had proven that humanity could stand against the galaxy's mightiest forces, but the battle was far from over. "We wait," Wells said, his voice low but filled with a quiet, burning intensity. "We wait and we prepare. We've sent a message, but now the galaxy will come to us, and when they do, we will be ready." The tension in the room thickened. The crew of the Titanic had just faced the impossible, and they had emerged victorious. But the real battle against the galaxy's greatest powers was still ahead of them. As the crew went back to their stations, Wells stood at the front of the bridge, staring out into the abyss. The Vora were beaten, their empire shattered. But that wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The galaxy had seen the power of humanity, and now it would come for them, one way or another. The Titanic was ready. Humanity was ready. The galaxy was about to learn what happened when they pushed too far. "Captain," Jackson said, his voice filled with tension, There's another fleet on the edge of our sensors. It's large, too large for just a few ships. They're coming for us. Wells' expression hardened. They've seen us, he muttered, and they're coming. He turned to face his crew, his voice steady, filled with unshakable resolve. Ready the ship, Wells ordered. We've got a fight ahead of us, and this time, we finish it. The Titanic's engines hummed as the ship prepared for battle. The crew was ready. Humanity had stood tall against the Vora, but now it was time to face something even bigger. The galaxy had no idea what was coming, but humanity did, and the Titanic would lead the charge. This time, the message would be even clearer. The stars stretched out before the Titanic, vast and cold, each one a reminder of how small humanity once seemed in the grand scheme of the galaxy. But now, humanity had earned its place among the stars, and the entire galaxy knew it. The Vora had learned the hard way that humans were not a myth. Now other alien empires were watching, studying, and deciding how to react. Captain Nathaniel Wells stood at the bridge's command station, his hands clasped behind his back. The silence in the room was thick, heavy with anticipation. The Titanic had taken a beating, its outer hull scarred and burned from the battle with the Vora, but it was still standing. And so was humanity. Captain, Lieutenant Jackson's voice broke the stillness. Another fleet is on the horizon. It's massive, too big to be just a scout. Wells turned his attention to the view screen, his eyes narrowing. The vast expanse of space stretched before him, but there, slowly coming into view, was a fleet larger than any he had seen before. Its ships were unlike anything they had encountered, sleek, massive, and terrifying. "Who are they?" Wells asked, his voice low but steady. "We're trying to get an ID on the ships," Jackson replied, his fingers flying over the control panel. "But they're not broadcasting any kind of signature we've ever encountered. It's almost as if they're unknown." Wells stared at the ships, his mind racing. The Vora had been a clear enemy, their empire built on conquest and power. But this fleet was different. No one had seen anything like it. And if these ships were as dangerous as they seemed, humanity was about to face a test like no other. "Get a message out to Earth," Wells said, his voice cold and commanding. "Tell them we might be facing something new and prepare the ship. I don't care what it takes, we will not back down." The crew worked quickly, preparing for whatever might come next. The Titanic had faced down a fleet that should have crushed it. But this was different. The unknown fleet could be the beginning of something much bigger. The stakes had never been higher. The seconds ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last. Wells felt the weight of leadership pressing on him. He had led his crew through one impossible battle already, but this was something else. He had no idea what this new enemy was capable of, but one thing was certain: humanity couldn't afford to lose. "Captain," Jackson called again, his voice urgent. "We're receiving a transmission. It's from the unknown fleet." Wells turned to face the screen, his jaw set. A figure appeared on the screen. A tall alien with pale, silver skin and eyes that glowed with an eerie light. Its face was expressionless, but the coldness in its gaze sent a chill down Wells' spine. The alien spoke, its voice smooth but filled with authority. "Human vessel, this is your first and final warning. We are the Xylar Dominion, and we do not tolerate threats to our empire. You will surrender or face the consequences." Wells' grip on the armrest tightened. He had expected some kind of response, but not this. The Xylar Dominion, an empire so old, so powerful that it had never been challenged, until now. The Xylar's eyes flickered for a moment, as if assessing him. "You defeated the Vora, but that is nothing compared to what we can do. Your victory was nothing more than a fleeting moment. Surrender now, and we may spare your pathetic species." The message ended, and the alien's face vanished from the screen. The crew remained silent, the tension in the air so thick it could be felt. Wells' mind raced. The Xylar Dominion was unlike anything humanity had faced. They were a galactic power with a reputation that stretched across the stars. The Vora were a ruthless empire, but the Xylar were something else entirely. They were older, colder, and far more advanced. "Captain," Jackson's voice broke through his thoughts. "What do we do?" Wells stood still for a long moment, his mind running through the possibilities. They could surrender, they could try to escape, or they could stand their ground. But standing down was never an option. Not now, not after everything they had fought for. "No surrender," Wells said firmly, his voice unwavering. "We've faced impossible odds before. This time will be no different. Prepare for battle." The crew reacted instantly, springing into action as the Titanic's systems came alive. Wells felt the ship rumble beneath his feet as its weapons powered up. The Xylar Dominion might have the numbers, but humanity had proven one thing already. It didn't matter how big the enemy was. What mattered was the will to fight, and the Titanic was full of that will. The Xylar fleet moved closer, their ships gleaming like dark giants in the blackness of space. The sheer size of the fleet was intimidating, but Wells refused to back down. He stood at the command station, his expression set with determination. Humanity had fought for its survival, and now it would fight for its future. "All guns lock onto the largest ships," Wells ordered. "Prepare to fire on my mark." The Titanic's weapons hummed with energy, the cannons glowing brighter as they powered up. Wells could feel the weight of his decision. If they failed, it would be the end. The Xylar Dominion would wipe them out without a second thought, but humanity wasn't going to go down without a fight. "Fire," Wells shouted. The Titanic's guns roared to life, unleashing a barrage of energy beams that tore through space and struck the Xylar ships with overwhelming force. The enemy fleet retaliated almost immediately, their weapons lighting up the darkness in a deadly storm of energy. The Titanic rocked with each impact, but its shields held, crackling with power. The ship retaliated with all its might, unleashing wave after wave of fire, each shot a testament to humanity, will to survive. The crew fought in perfect unison, their movements sharp and coordinated, each person knowing their part in the battle. The Titanic was more than a ship now. It was humanity's heart, its soul, and it would not be broken. The Xylar fleet pressed forward, but they hadn't anticipated the Titanic's strength. Each blast from the Titanic shattered their shields, each missile sent them reeling. The first few ships fell quickly, their dark forms breaking apart as the Titanic's fire tore through them. Wells watched the battle unfold, his eyes never leaving the screen. The Xylar fleet was large, but they were not invincible. Humanity had already proven that size meant nothing in the face of determination. Another wave of Xylar fire hit the Titanic, and this time the ship shuddered violently. Sparks flew from broken systems and the lights flickered. But still, the Titanic pushed forward, its guns firing faster, more determined. The Xylar were relentless, but the Titanic was unstoppable. The warship cut through their ranks, breaking their lines and leaving their ships in ruin. With each passing minute, the Xylar fleet grew weaker, their numbers dwindling. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the Xylar fleet began to retreat. Their remaining ships turned and fled into the depths of space, disappearing into the darkness. The crew of the Titanic erupted in cheers, their relief palpable. Wells remained calm, his face unreadable, but in his chest, a fire burned brighter than ever. The message had been clear: humanity was no myth, and no empire, no matter how powerful, could stand against it. Wells turned to his crew, his voice steady but filled with purpose. "We've won today, but the galaxy will never forget what we've done. This is just the beginning. Humanity's time has come." The galaxy had just learned its first real lesson: never underestimate humanity. And as the Titanic sailed into the unknown, Wells knew the future was theirs to shape.